Yeah, so it works like if we take them out a day earlier. Yeah.
This is a very sophisticated conference room, so I'm a little bit confused. But anyway, my name is Ivars Pundurs. For those who don't know me, I'm Latvian ambassador here in Geneva to all sorts of international organizations. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, very warm welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us today at this conference, Bridging Continents, Security, Human Rights Violations, and Disinformation from Europe to Africa. We are proud to host this event together with the missions of Estonia and Poland, and very warm thanks to our colleagues in these missions. So our goal today is to understand how the threats that we face, unfortunately, more and more frequently, both in Europe and in Africa, how they are increasingly interconnected. Disinformation, human rights abuses, and destabilizing influence operations, they cross borders and they affect us all. So to discuss this, we are honored today to have with us a distinguished panel. And now from the beginning, I apologize if I misspell names, but I'll start with Mariam Lambert, who is CEO of Emile Foundation, Keir Giles, writer and expert on Russian military and information warfare, Alexandre Vautravers, Associate Fellow at the GCSP, where we find ourselves today, and Editor-in-Chief of the Swiss Military Review, as well as, last but not least, Philip Obaji, Nigerian journalist and activist, and winner of the Future Awards Africa Prize. I found it on internet. And the discussion today will be moderated by Žanete Ozoliņa, Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science, University of Latvia, whom we sincerely thank, not least because it is also my alma mater. So later today, we will screen documentary, A Life We Did Not Choose, Russian Vault. Here, I would like to express our deep gratitude to its producer, Julia Kabitsyna-Cabiere. She's not only created this powerful film in cooperation with the Museum of Occupation in Latvia, but she also is behind this very idea to have this event. And without her dedication and vision, this gathering simply would not have been possible. So we thank her wholeheartedly. So you know the topics for today's discussion. I will not spend time on that. Let today's exchange strengthen our understanding and our resolve. These challenges we are facing are global, and our response must be collective, rooted in truth, human dignity, and international law. Thank you, and I wish all of us a productive conversation and event. Thank you. And now, since there are more than one ambassador present, they all usually have to speak. So, Miroslav, in the name of Poland.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really proud to be here, and thank you very much for your presence. Mission of Poland is very pleased to contribute to this event. It's very important for us, and we thank main organizers from Mission of Latvia as well as Mission of Estonia for cooperation. And let me also thank our distinguished panelists and producers of the movie which we are going to see. Ladies and gentlemen, disinformation has become a part of our life. It enters our homes, it enters our private life, and none of us expected, even I would say 10, 15 years, the scale of this completely new phenomenon. By being so common, it brings also certain risk that the threshold of our tolerance to this phenomenon may get lower. And we have to avoid such a tendency for any price. Disinformation is not a new normal. It's a fatal danger for our security, democracy, and human rights. Of course, we cannot prevent disinformation, but we can and have to counter this threat. We can make us more aware and more resilient. It is important not to remain silent, even in case of, at the first sight, very innocent fake news in infosphere. A zero-tolerance policy should apply in this regard. The main motto of the Polish presidency in the first part of this year was Security Europe. It was not just about military security, but also the resilience to disinformation and hybrid threats. We must acknowledge the truth. Only strong democracies will be able to face external threats. We face disinformation from different sources and geographical locations, but we know that one source is prevailing. After the recent incidents on the Polish railway, the Russian media attempt to portray this act of sabotage, or rather terrorist act, as a Ukrainian provocation or a sign of indigenous dissatisfaction with ongoing support to Ukraine. The activity of pro-Russian accounts in our information space shows signs of coordination. And we will closely monitor the infosphere in order to prevent possible disinformation on those incidents. And I think that these are the reasons that organization of such event like this is very important, not only for Poland, not only for our region, but for the whole international community. I thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Ambassador of Ukraine, permanent representative to international organizations here. And I'm really grateful to organizers of this event that they choose such a topic, which actually, if you talk about security, if you talk about disinformation, about human rights, all this is very topical notions in Ukraine currently. And everything is really interrelated. UN monitoring mission on human rights in Ukraine, they are reporting daily about violations of human rights, about Russian continued attacks on civilian infrastructure, on buildings of where people live. Just a recent episode the day before yesterday. Yesterday it was an attack on which was done on western part of Ukraine mainly, and this time city of Ternopil and Lviv they suffered most, and in Ternopil there was a house hit, multi-store building, and more than 28 persons are identified as killed, and much more are wounded. And still there is a work ongoing on this place. Bodies are recovered from under debris. This is only one episode of this long, prolonged, or the Russian war of aggression, which is going on too long. Another side of the story is the territory on other side of contact line. I mean, occupied territories. Yesterday, in the Third Committee of the United Nations, it was draft resolution adopted on human rights in the occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, adopted with better results even than the year before. But still, there are many countries who abstained. There are many countries, quite a number of countries, who voted against. And this, what I'm talking now about, disinformation. So Russian disinformation still allows to keep those countries under their narratives, to influence them, and to proceed from their approaches, sometimes even direct threats. But the fact that still this situation shows that even on such a kind of obvious topic, occupied territories, United Nations is not united yet, despite of majority voting in favor. And the movie or the documentary which we will see today is devoted to the life on occupied territories. This is really, to say it is a huge problem, it's just very, very soft. Because for people who lives there and who is forced to be under such a condition, such a pressure, and such a situation every day, day after day, without a hope for tomorrow, maybe the hope for the day after tomorrow. But it is really very difficult when occupants are coming to you and enforcing you to take a Russian passport. If you don't take Russian passport, you will have no opportunity to access school, to access hospital, even to buy medicine in pharmacy. Or when children on the territories which were occupied in 2014, there are children who were at the time of occupation 7 years old, but now they are at the age of 18, and they are forcibly conscripted into Russian army. They are forced to fight against against Ukrainians. Actually, Ukrainians are forced to fight against Ukrainians, and they don't have a choice. They are forced to join Russian army. These are just elements of the situation. I have to add to this also mismanagement of so-called government or acting people who are leading occupying forces in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Because the attitude to occupied territories is like to territories of second sort. So they and population of the second sort. Salaries are much lower than in the mainland of Russia. Of course, I'm not asking for having salaries higher. We are in favor of returning territories back to Ukraine. But if you talk about people under which conditions they have to survive, so this is really difficult for them. Currently, there are huge problems with water supply. I'm talking not about Crimea, I'm talking about Donetsk region, which was okay before they started managing this region. Also, there are problems of different type, everyday life of people, economic problems of people. So this is really very difficult. Children in schools, indoctrination, they have no opportunity to speak their language. They are not able to learn Ukrainian curricula. And this will be it is and it will be a huge problem for future reintegration of those territories in the mainland of Ukraine. So I'm sure that you will see it in the documentary, and you will see it because witnesses who will be presenting this, they will do it better than me because they are witnesses, they experience these things. From my side, I'm really grateful to all of you that you are here, that you will be a part of this discussion today. Of course, Ukraine, it is something which hurts me most, but of course, I am fully engaged in discussion on in Africa, in everywhere in the world, because disinformation and relationship, human rights and security is very much topical today. So thank you very much for conducting this event, and I'm really impressed for names of speakers, panelists, and waiting for your presentations. Thank you.
So I will start with, I think I have to use microphone. Is it on? Yeah. So I would like to start with thanking all three ambassadors for giving so rational and emotional introduction to our conversation. And I think that each of us in one or another way, and particularly panelists, are having some experience with Ukraine. And we know that the nation, which is in war, starting from 2014 and in more than last 3 years and a half, are actively fighting for their own sovereignty, for their own rights to define future of their nation. They are having a lot of difficulties, if I put it mildly, which they are facing and dealing with on daily basis. And war has very different faces, but none of them is the one we would like to see. So therefore, it's very important to discuss not only military aspect of what's going in Ukraine, but also to address human rights issues, to address disinformation issues, to address cultural heritage, identity issues, and more and more and more. And I think that this is the added value of today's discussions, because I think we know that discussions on war in Ukraine are taking place almost on daily basis. At least in our countries, we are used to those discussions. But what is very important, it's very important that we address this diversity of the situation which is taking place in Ukraine at the present moment. And today's panelists have quite unique expertise on the very different issues. So therefore, I would like to start the discussion with the first question to all panelists. Beyond military consequences and impacts of the war, what you would mention, what are other impacts on individuals, on society, and the country in general, as I said, in terms of human rights, in terms of culture, in terms of identity issues, in terms of disinformation? And probably let's start, Philip, with you.
Thank you so much. It's really very good to be here and to have the next few minutes to talk about exactly what's going on in Africa and by extension in Eastern Europe, because I was lucky enough to visit Ukraine 2 days ago. In fact, I'm coming from Ukraine to Geneva. Let me first start with me as a person. I remember just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, January 2022, this is the time I'm talking about, I heard from some of my sources in the Central African Republic that Russia was preparing to move about 200 local militiamen in the Central African Republic and send them to Ukraine's Donbas region to fight for Russia. And at this time, they had not begun the full-scale invasion. So I picked up my phone and composed a message to Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin. I said, my sources in Central Africa are telling me that the Wagner Group is about to send 200 members of the local militia group, the Union for Peace, to Moscow on training and then to the front lines in Ukraine. The following day, I got a phone call from somebody claiming to be speaking on behalf of Yevgeny Prigozhin. And he said 3 words, or 4 words, in fact. You are a fool. And then he went on to say, you report rubbish about Prigozhin, about Russia, and what have you. It wasn't strange because oftentimes some of us who are journalists receive lots of insults and abuses online. And many of these people come from Russia, people linked to Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency. Much later, I started to see on Telegram channels that I had, in fact, reached out to Prigozhin to beg for money. And some other channels were like, he's a monkey doing the bidding of the West. So it was my first feel of disinformation coming from somewhere in Russia. And I could have given up because, let's be honest, it affected me a little bit because it was my reputation on the line. But it opened another chapter in my life, and it was an opportunity for me to look into exactly what these people really do, this whole Wagner Group and the Internet Research Agency that Prigozhin founded. So it was the beginning of my investigation into Russian disinformation. And as we speak, that is a campaign that is growing across Africa. Every single region in Africa, from West to Central Africa, to East Africa, and to Southern Africa, we are facing a big problem with Russian disinformation. And oftentimes it's targeted at Ukraine and Europe, with claims that the US and Europe are moving bioweapons labs from Ukraine to Africa, and weapons, they claim, are flying across Africa and ending up in the hands of rebel groups and jihadist groups and other militia groups. So Russian disinformation has become catastrophic in Africa, destabilizing communities, even breaking up democracies. So that's the impact of this campaign. Now, in terms of human rights, we see also in a number of countries, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, how people are being slaughtered. Children have been kidnapped, and many of them live in mining communities. So Russia, through the Wagner Group, have been involved in countries like Mali and Central African Republic. And the reason they're involved there is to see how they can gain access to the gold and diamond mines in these countries. And they're doing that with huge and utmost brutality. I have also been a victim, story for another day.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. It's just the beginning. We will definitely come back to these issues. So, Keir, what would be your definition or your vision of Russia's aggression beyond military failed?
Well, Žanete, I think you put it very well, saying that the military aspect is only one part of the problem. And I say this as somebody whose primary field of study was Russian military hard power. I'm even kindly described as a military expert up there, that it's a profound mistake to think of the Russian challenge as being solely or even primarily a military one. Because yes, military aggression is the means by which Russia achieves its objectives, but those objectives go far broader. And the waging of a war of colonial reconquest is precisely so that those other means of subjugating the peoples, which Russia sees as rightly governed from Moscow, can be enacted. It's what happens after the military occupation, after the redrawing of borders by Russia, after the seizure of territories and peoples that is of the greatest concern. And there's an unbroken tradition within Russian history which is still being played out today. The scenes that we see of enslavement of peoples are fully within the Russian tradition of cultural erasure, Russification, and genocide, which is not a word I use lightly. I know that the lawyers among us have very strict definitions for when you can use this word, but on a purely human level, the erasure of a people's identity surely counts as this. And that is the primary objective of what Russia is trying to do when it says, no, these peoples that we seek to conquer should be Russian. They are, in fact, not a separate identity. They are merely frustrated and slightly inferior Russians waiting to be liberated by our war of reconquest. So everything that we'll hear about through the rest of the course of this evening, the means by which Russia exerts its control in those occupied territories, the Russification, the passportization, the eradication of Ukrainian culture, is something with which the frontline states are familiar within living memory. And that is why those frontline states, like the ones represented here, are the most convinced that further Russian expansion has to be stopped. And therefore, they are the ones that give the greatest support to Ukraine, because they know that Ukraine is holding the front line for the whole of Europe. Because, God forbid, the same fate should be visited on other peoples further afield. And that is why Ukraine needs all of our support, because it is the bulwark against not just the military expansion of Russia, but also the expansion of that murderous Russian culture that we see playing out in the occupied territories now.
Thank you, Keir. I will ask the same question to Mariam. You also are very much engaged in Ukrainian matters. So how do you see Russia's aggression beyond military field?
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor. So I'm more focusing on the human rights side of it. And incidentally, actually today, it's the International Children's Day. And we are working on children who are illegally deported to Russia, occupied territories. When I said we are working, it means our team and myself, we spend 74 missions in the frontline villages. So it's not only disinformation from the media, but also what we have witnessed ourselves. The biggest disinformation for us, and that we are trying really to counter disinformation, is when it comes to children deportation. So we are talking about numbers which are horrific. So according to the Ukrainian authority, they have identified 19,546 children were being deported illegally to Russia-occupied territories. The Russian Federation are claiming, and this is the biggest disinformation, that they have saved 700,000 children. Of course, this is completely untrue, and we will speak about that briefly now. And the numbers could vary, because the problem is we don't have access to occupied territories, so we don't have access to information in Russia, and Russia doesn't share any information with the Ukrainian authorities of the family. When they are claiming that, I thought it's such a big lie that no one will believe it. And then we started to advocate about this issue in India, in Brazil, in BRICS countries. And they were telling me that we know the topic, and the Russians are saving those children from this war. And this is where we understood that the disinformation was the biggest weapon in this war. When they said saved 700,000, if it was the case, they would have applied the principles of the Geneva Convention, which are very simple. The first step, when you are transferring children in armed conflict, you have to evacuate them to a third country for safety. The second point is to make sure that you share this information with the Ukrainian authorities about the children that you have, and also with the family. Also to give this information to the Red Cross International and also UNICEF. and to allow UNICEF and the Red Cross to visit those children in order to make sure that they are safe. Those are the principles that should be applied to all children in armed conflict. For 3 years, they haven't done any of these. And in the opposite, actually, we have a report on the Yale Humanitarian Lab report from Nathaniel Raymond. He published in December 2024 that 314 children from Lugansk and Donetsk were found in a Russian adoption database. Name were changed, date of birth. They also moved them to another location to avoid detection. So the Russians have done really the opposite. And that's, for me, the biggest part that we need to fight, because not only there is a huge disinformation about those children, but now we are talking about disinformation to the children directly. So the children who are stolen, deported, kidnapped, because we shouldn't be scared of the word, they are telling to those children that their parents abandoned them, that they don't want to see them, that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore, that this is their country. They are giving them Russian, they are giving them Russian passport, as you have mentioned. But the catastrophe of this is we are talking about 1.6 million of children who are still living in occupied territories. 1.6 million of children who will be forcibly deported, who will be militarized, who will be given for adoption. So we have to think about when we are asking the President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to stop this war, to accept the peace agreement because it's been 3.5 years. That means that you're accepting the fact that those children, 1.6 million in occupied territories, will be under the hands of the Russian, under torture, abused. So when we are talking about peace agreement, we need to think about what we are talking about. It's not just about land, it's about culture, identity, and the future generation of Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam. And now I will give floor to our fourth panelist, Alexander, from your perspective. So what goes beyond military?
Thank you very much. I have to introduce this response by telling you a little bit of a story. At the time the war started, the aggression against Ukraine started, I was in charge of security of the canton of Geneva. We had just had a peace talk in September of 2021. We could already feel that things were going south, were going very sour. And as of the beginning of the war, I was nominated by the Geneva government as the Geneva delegate for the Ukraine crisis, and had on my hands to take care of a very substantial number of refugees from Ukraine who were popping up, and we needed to react very quickly. Let me just say that I went back into the books. What did we have in terms of crisis response in Geneva? Had we thought that something like this was ever going to be possible? And I'll just say this. The numbers that we had envisaged, how many refugees would come to Geneva in a case of a war or a natural disaster, were 3 times less than the numbers that we actually had. So to answer your question, Madam Chair, let me say 3 things very briefly. First of all, there is a before 2022 and there is a world after 2022. We are no longer in the dividends of peace, in case somebody has not noticed. We are in a different world. Opinions have changed, and this has put a lot of things into question and has challenged a number of decisions, opinions, and structures. Secondly, we are in a completely different geopolitical situation. Perhaps we will want to talk about this later. And we are witnessing an unprecedented rearmament, which is extremely costly to many countries around the world. We can talk about numbers later if you want. And thirdly, because we are in Geneva, because I started my career at the ICRC not very far from here, and because we are close to the Palais des Nations, let me say that also the international community has been extremely challenged and has been extremely silent with regards to this conflict.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you very much for bringing one more topic to our discussion, and these are war refugees. people who are forcefully actually pushed out of their countries to save their lives and children's lives. And we're not talking about dozens of people, we are talking about millions of people. So, and it's also a question of their identity, it's a question of their futures, of their employment, and more and more and more. So this is definitely a very important issue. And when you were talking, I was recalling that when war started after 2 months, I think it was in April, I was in Nice, and I saw some kind of, there was printed on a paper and glued at the walls that there will be gathering of Ukrainians in Nice. And I went to this gathering and they were protesting against war, and there were really approximately around 2,000 young women with children. So, and this was a sign that this is the war of the 21st century, unfortunately, which forces us Europeans, and not only Europeans, think about policies which we haven't actually introduced before. And I was also working with disinformation issues in one of the EU-funded projects, and we interviewed quite many Ukrainian war refugees. And they actually are, to some extent, ignorant about the scale of disinformation which is taking place in Europe and globally, because they do not speak French, German, English languages. But they are very much aware of disinformation as such, and they are excellent resource of data, of information for us who are doing studies. So therefore, I think this is a group of people which has to be integrated and really made as a very important source for our intellectual capability on this information. So thank you very much for bringing this point. But then I wanted to ask question which actually is very much debated among experts, but still it's not it's not exhausted yet. And the topic is that at least in the Baltic states, we talk about Russia's disinformation starting from restoration of independence, because disinformation was always there. But disinformation as a massive phenomenon started to spread after 2014, Russia's disinformation. And we acknowledge that this is a global phenomenon. Russia doesn't stop at the borders, as Philip very correctly mentions that. But can we talk about certain success or impact of Russia's global disinformation? Is there any effect which you could mention as an example? Who would like to? Okay, you will start.
Well, I think Alexandre has already mentioned one effect. He said that the international community has been silent on what Russia is doing. Not universally true, of course. Those countries and those people that understand the issues and understand what is at stake are vocal about it. And of course, we sitting here are part of that effort now. But the fact that there are so many other societies and countries around the world that are not taking a stand against open aggression and a colonial war is a success in itself for Russia. And that's an indication of how Russia's use of information, which goes a lot further back than 2014, it's a persistently important tool in how Russia gets its way around the world, just one that has been turbocharged by the adoption of the internet and communications technologies, is for different purposes, whether to attack our societies in order to achieve Russia's aims when it seeks to attack us, or indeed to give Russia itself greater freedom of maneuver to carry out what it wants to do. And we can point to success stories where that is happening. For instance, the long-standing campaign of nuclear intimidation, which constrained the coalition of countries backing Ukraine from giving their full support because they were convinced, wrongly, that Russia was on a nuclear hair trigger after 8 to 10 years of Russia preparing the groundwork for that being the default position of Western countries. Similarly, the ways in which Russia transfers the language which we use about events that are happening and replaces terminology and talks about a peace deal when it is in fact terms for Ukrainian surrender that we've seen in the media reporting over the last 24 hours. all of the different ways in which Russia subverts information in order to subvert our societies, but also to avoid the consequences for its actions. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Mariam to give some very specific examples of how that works, particularly in how Russia presents what it is doing in the occupied territories, because there are some very simple terminological substitutions in terms of presentation of action, which have been very effective in confusing the world about precisely what is happening. For instance, orphans.
Yes. So a lot of more and more people, especially, should I say a country, then I will be in trouble, but let's say United States, for example, when they started to have this discussion about the children issues, they are starting now to rethink what is really happening. And we see a lot of disinformation. President Zelensky has handed over 300 names, but we are claiming 19,000. So maybe not all of them are deported. Just to speak on behalf of the president, but the reason he handed over 300 names is because we don't trust Russia. If we give them all information about the 19,000, of course, those children they will change the name and passport and everything. So we go step by step. When it comes to orphans, and that's what we hear all the time, every day, even in France yesterday, is that those children were orphans. So maybe, and people are really hesitating to tell him that, but they said maybe they're better in a Russian family because it's better to be in a family than in an institution. Those children are not orphans. Because in Ukraine, there is a law like in France or Belgium, I don't know if in Switzerland, where for when the family has financial issues, mental health issues, all the sorts of issues, they had the right to put their children in a specialized school for children with disability, for example, or in an institution temporarily or on permanent basis. So all those children, most of them, they have mothers, fathers, sisters, grandmothers. This is why our work now is really to look into all the relatives of those children who were deported to Russia in order for them to testify publicly, to show to people that those children are not orphans, they have relatives, and that's very important to explain. And the second point is there was a war, and also the fact that it's not really deportation, they've been transferred, or the family hand them over to the Russian for safety. So people need to understand how a deportation is taking place. A deportation starts when a city gets invaded. When a city gets invaded for different reasons, and most of the time it's because Ukrainian authorities didn't manage to get the military support they needed to protect that city. So when it gets invaded, the Russians are closing that city, the town. They're cutting off all communication, humanitarian support, medical support. They're cutting everything off. And then starts the deportation of children in schools, in kindergartens, in foster family, in institution, and they take them by group. There is no one to report. The families who suddenly go to school and they don't find their children, they can't even report to the authorities because they are under occupation. So they can't even report to the Ukrainian because they are cut off any communication. So in Kherson, for example, they had to wait 9 months until Kherson got liberated again in order to start reporting on the missing children and then start the investigation on returning them. So that's very important. Deportation doesn't happen by accident. It's really an organized, systematic crime that happens when a city gets invaded, and children are not orphans.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alexander, you mentioned geopolitics. So I think this is an area where disinformation actually is spreading quite effectively. Do you agree?
Yes, it's a long discussion, but essentially Russia has tried to make enormous efforts for us to forget that there's a war going on. And there's all sorts of euphemisms, and if euphemism is too complicated a word, there are ways to go around the word war and to call this a special military operation. And of course, today we can be ironic about this because probably it was in the plans to do something very short and very quick, very swift, and then to move on to other matters. But there's another terminology which we in the West need to be extremely careful about. And I'm saying this conscious of the fact that even in countries like Switzerland, we are talking about hybrid warfare. And let me say, hybrid warfare is war. It is a whole series of actions that are destined to prepare to create favorable conditions for war. And by using this denomination hybrid warfare, we are trying to sell the idea that we don't need to defend ourselves. It's not that serious. There are a couple of years ahead of us, ahead of time. We have more time. No, the reality is hybrid warfare is part of a plan, and this plan is called war. It's a phase of a war, and until we have been able to attribute a certain number of actions, be it sabotage, be it cyber attacks, etc., we have to start again calling things by their real names. Hybrid warfare is war. And unfortunately, to conclude to your question, which is an important one, unfortunately, the Russian disinformation efforts are landing in Europe in particular. Perhaps we can discuss elsewhere around the world, but all of this disinformation is happening in a relatively favorable and fertile ground. And we have to be aware of this because, and I have been talking about this in universities and elsewhere for quite some time, but postmodernism has harmed the media structures, the institutional structures, to such a point where today even people who are professionally interested in trying to find the truth and to write research articles or student papers. I'm saying this because we are in a university, and perhaps some people may feel concerned. You look at different sources and so on. So you challenge, you are critical with these sources. But we have gone so far down this postmodern road that eventually today we have really quite a bit of trouble calling things by their simple and true name. Hybrid warfare is warfare.
Thank you very much for reminding that. I hope that we will not go so far as sometimes Russian opponents who renamed Lev Tolstoy's War and Peace novel into Special Operation and Peace. So it's very important to call things as they are. Before I will give floor to you, Felipe, I would like to remind the audience that you are invited also to ask questions to our distinguished panelists because we have limited time for our discussion. And if you have really urgent issues which you would like to ask, then yeah. So just a second, I will give floor to Felipe and then I will come to your question. Okay, Felipe, what about the global impact? You as a journalist, as activists living in Africa, so how you would frame the issue of Russia's disinformation impact globally?
If I have to narrow this down to Africa, I will say one of the places where Russian disinformation has had the most consequential impact, it's on the African continent. Because in many places, the awareness of Russia's imperial identity is very, very low. And because we have lived in centuries of colonial rule, and even after many countries began to gain independence in the 1950s and 1960s, Africa hasn't matched up with many developing countries in terms of development. And so it's easy to point fingers to people who live very far away. For example, in places in the Sahelian part of Africa, people are still living in conflict, mostly brought by jihadist insurgents. And there has been efforts by Western nations to help deal with this conflict, to help deal with this insurgency. For example, France has been involved in Burkina Faso and Mali for many years. And despite that involvement in trying to deal with these terrorist groups, the result hasn't really been favorable. And many Africans in that region believe that the reason why the war and the issues in the Sahel continues is because the West has been complacent. And Russia has seen an opening in this level of agitation. And so its disinformation campaign targets those kinds of resentment, those kinds of dissatisfaction. And Russia has RT, a state-owned channel that broadcasts from Algeria. And sadly, I'll say sadly because the impact of this broadcast has had more negative effects than positive. So sadly, more than 30 countries in Africa are able to have their citizens access RT free of charge. So what many people watch on TV in many places is the propaganda and the disinformation that RT disseminates to ordinary Africans. But that's not all. Internet penetration is growing very fast across the continent, and we have massive amounts of Russian trolls and people who really are paid influencers by the Russian Federation. So much of what you see these days on the internet really is Russian disinformation. And the result is this. A lot of African countries are falling to military dictatorship. At least 2 of these countries have soldiers in power who were in Russia on training only to return back to seize power. So now the troubling part, the stubborn part is the fact that the majority of the population were very happy that these guys seized power because they have been told, courtesy of these Russian trolls and disinformation experts, that the reason why democracy is not working in Africa is because the West has used African leaders, elected leaders, to do business against what should be beneficial to the ordinary African. So you see that across the continent, this disinformation that's having impact on governance, having impact on how people live their lives, have really come from very far away. And that is very, very troubling. So the difference somehow with how we embrace disinformation in Africa as against how it's embraced in the West is the fact that to a greater degree, people can identify, not many, I know that it's still a big issue in Europe, but some people can identify exactly the objective of some of this content that they see. And efforts to battle disinformation in the West has gained traction. And there's more funding to organizations that will otherwise fact check or even help to counter these narratives. But we are facing a big issue in Africa when it comes to funding to research, to fact check, to battle. And it's even made worse by recent cuts in budgets from the US and also the closing down of organizations like the USAID and what have you. So we have a big problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing one more issue on the table. It's disinformation and governance. And I think that it's definitely a global phenomenon, of course, that in each continent and in each country, it has its specific context, but as a tendency, it's definitely a very global one. Probably now we could take a few questions before we continue our discussion. So the gentleman here was asking, Julia, or you? And please identify yourself and whom you are addressing.
Thank you. So since I have to identify myself, I am surely not a gentleman. My name is Boris Engelson. I am a journalist freelance. My question is, I hope, rather simple. In the past, we have witnessed more than once in the 20th century, in the 19th century, that the defeated ones were eventually the victors. I mean, those who were defeated militarily and sometimes demographically have become culturally and historically the winners. An arch example are the Indian Wars. Today in America, even Donald Trump doesn't dare banning the Western films which render homage every day to the society, the culture, and the ordeal of Indians. The same has occurred more or less with the Vietnam War. Vietnam has had the upper hand symbolically, morally, etc., even within the US, not inside Vietnam. This is another story. We have the same with the cartoons, Obelix and Asterix, which render homage to those who were colonized by Roman imperialists. But today, it seems that we are no longer in the same, let's say, dynamic. And the people of the world love disinformation. Africans love disinformation. They consider that it is good for them. And I see no sign of so-called intersectional struggle to defeat lies and disinformation. So how do you explain that today, what was so obvious in the time of la guerre du droit, the World War I was la guerre du droit, doesn't work anymore? Has truth been demonetized? And my second shorted question, what game play Russia and Israel together?
Thank you. I think we will skip the second one, but we will take the first one. And I think, Philip, it's exactly the question to you. So why people like this information?
And Russian, there is no possibility to arouse love for truth in Russia. Not like during the Vietnam War in the US.
So sometimes people will spread disinformation, take advantage of the agitation of the people, the concerns of the people, the policy at the time. And I speak from the African perspective because I have been privileged to travel across the continent to look at the impact of disinformation. And we come from a background of conflict, background of, in some places, hunger and poverty. And what I think Russia wants from Africa, for example, is new friends. Because you see, in Europe, you have Europe united against what Russia is doing in Ukraine. You look at the West, the rest of the Western world, they are united at least in terms of condemnation. In terms of how they act militarily is another topic for debate. But over in Africa, we base our support on what we get back. And it's been the case even under apartheid in South Africa. At the time they got support from some of the old Soviet republics. So Africa has not taken a stand. And Russia has seen an opportunity in this regard, especially because it believes that many African nations have coasted up to the West over the years, over the decades. So by trying to find new partners in Africa, it feels that it will have more friends, at least to have support when it comes to UN resolutions. So having to break up democracies in parts of Africa is a strategy to have people who are Russian-leaning take over power. We've seen it in Mali, we've seen it in Burkina Faso, we've seen it in Niger. So that's the strategy. And I'm sure the rest of them will talk more about what's going on in Europe. But it thrives because people over the years have become tired with the way things have been. They feel democracy doesn't work anymore, and the Russians are helping to make them have that belief. For example, you go to Nigeria, where I come from. Now, there's a lot of ethnic divisions in Nigeria, so there's also religious division. We have a majority Muslim north and a majority Christian south. And sometimes the narratives you see on social media are narratives that make people believe that Christians are victims of Muslim genocide. I'm sure you've been hearing a lot about that recently. And before the US began to talk about Christians being killed, we've already seen Russian sites propaganding, giving fake figures about genocide in Nigeria. We've seen Russian trolls talk about, leadership in Nigeria being against many ethnic groups. So they look for the problems that people are usually, used to worry about to target these areas with disinformation.
Thank you. Alexandra, you wanted to comment.
Merci beaucoup, ça me fait plaisir. 20 ans après, vous posez toujours les mêmes questions. I'm going to answer this question in a scientific way. If you're interested seriously in disinformation, you need to read Vladimir Volkov, who was a Russian refugee who eventually went to France, and he became a ghostwriter for Charles de Gaulle. And that's why, that's one of the reasons he won a number of prizes, and he entered the Académie Française, despite the fact that the only public books that he published during his lifetime were actually children's books. But eventually, if you look at his posthumous writings, there is a fantastic book, Petite Histoire de la Désinformation, in which you have the method and the 7 different types or tools for disinformation. And so the question, unfortunately, was not well asked. It's the reverse that is true. It is not that people love disinformation. It is that propaganda, disinformation that we can imagine or talk about or refer to in the Second World War or during the middle of the 20th century, that was relatively amateuristic. We now have 70 years of marketing science and data to back up information operations and psychological operations. So it's not that people love disinformation, it's that the people who are doing disinformation are very good at what they do, and they base themselves on excellent data and very proven strategies. So one of these 7 strategies, because I'm not going to spoil the entire book tonight, I encourage you to continue reading. That's my message for tonight. One of these 7 tools is it is much, much easier to get people to believe and to adhere to something that they would like to believe. So if you have an already favorable ground, it will be much easier to convince people to go in that direction. You need to make much less effort.
Thank you. Keir, would you like to add something?
Briefly, yes, I know we're short on time. The problem is that we are operating in a hostile environment for truth, and it is getting rapidly worse. Some of the reasons Alexandre has already referred to, building on the base of what he called postmodernism and the devaluation of objective fact and truth in public discourse, accelerating the hostility of that environment through the intensification of use of these sophisticated techniques to use disinformation, augmented by the hyperconnectivity of the internet so that hostile actors can reach directly into our societies on a mass basis, rather than the slow and painstaking means that they would have used previously. Now we see the pace accelerating even further with the transformation of some of the platforms that people use to communicate into vectors for disinformation, such as, for example, the transformation of Twitter/X into effectively a cesspit of lies. And it's going to get worse, because those who would seek to poison our minds now have found that the means to do so is to poison the data sets that are feeding into AI systems, putting in the contaminated data into the large language models so that everybody who relies on those AI systems, which is a rapidly growing sector of the population, will receive that same tainted information and have the distorted view of the world that those that seek to attack us through information would like us all to have, because they have discovered that it is very much simpler, rather than serving somebody a cup of tainted water one by one, to poison the entire well from which they are drawing their information. And neither the platforms nor the AI system owners seem to be willing to take on the challenge of this and ensure that the environment from which we gather our information is one which is reliable at all. So things are getting rapidly worse, and there is little sign that it's going to change.
Thank you. Mariam.
Yes, I just wanted to add a small part, because I'm not an expert in disinformation, but I'm reporting on what I heard from the Ukrainian. They said that the one thing that it's really difficult for us to fight is not the war itself, but it's disinformation, because the Russians have been preparing that for years. I can't say numbers, but 20 years, which is impossible actually to catch up on all those years, because they've been training children children. So infiltration, we are not talking about infiltration, but that's what they've been doing. The Russians have been infiltrating Europe and in all institutions as well. So we see that some people are really from the opposition in the European Parliament. So those people were trained for years. And I think that's the difficult part. We're not just fighting against the Russian, but we are fighting amongst us, people who were trained for years, and now we see the result. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. We have to think about concluding part of our discussion because we are all eager to watch documentary movie. But coming to an end, actually, is the initial aim of this debate was not only discuss disinformation, human rights issues, and global impact of disinformation, but also address and at least to find for some solutions, recommendations, what kind of ideas do we have which could help to at least to achieve better results in the future. And probably I will start, Miriam, again with you. So because you are working with very focused area, children. So what would be the urgent issues or political decisions which have to be taken in order to improve the situation?
I think you mentioned that before. It's the funding on the disinformation organization who are working on disinformation. I think it's critical. From our point of view, it's really to gather as many countries as possible to ensure that the disinformation regarding the children deportation, disinformation regarding the children being orphans, the disinformation about the fact that we have some children were adopted by Russian officials, right hand of Putin, which is Sergei Mironov. Those kind of things that needs to be addressed at the highest level by the world leaders, which it's happening now, but not enough. So really putting that on the highest level, and also not mentioning the children topic is not part of any peace negotiation. It shouldn't be part of any, because they are not bargain chip and they are not negotiable, and you cannot exchange them with anyone. Because we could see this disinformation in the US when the Trump administration started to say that we have taken part of the first return of 8 children, and amongst them, one is Russian. So we make people believe that actually not only Ukrainian children were deported, but also Russian children. And that's something that really needs to be tackled at the highest level in every political agenda.
Thank you. Keir, you are working with European security issues, two organizations, the EU and NATO. So what they have to do now, but not tomorrow?
Well, first of all, whose job is it to counter disinformation? And both NATO and the EU have dabbled in the idea that it might be their task to do it, but a lot of it comes down to national approaches. And that's one of the reasons why it's so often hard to find one-size-fits-all answers, because these are questions of constitutionality and law and regulation and societal attitudes in individual countries, because they vary between countries. The attitude to the balance between being an open society and an open democracy and being so open that you make yourself extremely vulnerable. So answers have to be tailored to national conditions. And in that respect, there are ways in which countries can close off obvious self-inflicted vulnerabilities. And the example that comes to mind immediately is in my own country, the UK. Up until last year, it was perfectly legal to operate as the agent of a hostile power subverting the UK. It was a legislative gap which was closed very belatedly, and the closure of that gap through a new National Security Act has profoundly changed the behaviors of some of the people who were the most hostile agents against the UK. So it does work, and you can do things to improve your own national situation. But the one-size-fits-all answer is raising of awareness and understanding of just how severe and how damaging the threat is, because that is by no means universally understood across Europe and across the world. So simply gathering the understanding of the power of disinformation and how transformative it can be against the interests of the target country is the first step in so many of these places that up until now have left themselves as soft targets for information exploitation by Russia and by other powers that would seek to harm them.
Thank you, Keir. Alexander, national perspective, Keir emphasized. What about Swiss experience? What you are doing? And do you consider that you are well fit for countering disinformation?
I can't talk about Switzerland per se, but I think there is some truth, and I'd like to expand on what has just been said. There's a lot of limits to what we can do nationally, especially if nationals actually accept money from agents or agencies. So we're, I don't want to say defenseless, but there are limits to what we can do. And I think one of the two solutions that we can certainly bring forward is cooperation. And I mean international cooperation, because we are blind to some things that are so close to us that are happening inside our territory. And sometimes we need to have a friendly neighbor that knocks on our door and says, you should really take care of this particular issue. And if you want to talk about Switzerland, well, Switzerland has limits, legal limits and impediments, but at the same time, it can also provide information and be very helpful to others who are willing to cooperate with its services. So that's one. And number two, I'm going to say the same thing, but with different words. You talked about awareness. I will just say, let's stop with denial. If there is an easy solution, if there's an easy explanation, it's probably not the right one.
Thank you. And Philip, from your perspective as journalist, as activist, so what we on the individual level or on activist group level, what we can do countering disinformation?
I think we need to focus on getting results than talking too much. Because if I go back to what I see oftentimes in Nigeria, in Mali, I see a lot of meetings where people come. In fact, sometimes I think it costs more money to have meetings than the amount of money Russia spends in some places on disinformation. Yeah. I say this because with 50 euros, you could have Russian disinformation published in a reputable newspaper. And I've come here, it costs more than 1,000 euros to get me here in Switzerland. So that would have paid 10 newspapers to spread disinformation. So I think that the approach should be very direct. And the Russians understand how this works, especially in places like Africa. They know they don't have to spend too much because some people need the money to be able to feed their children. So you could feed 50 euros, they get the job done. So there must be a direct and conscious effort to deal with this. Unfortunately, so the problems that we have on the African continent is the fact that I don't think internationally people recognize how deep this is and how this affects even the stability of democracies in Africa. So the funding to be able to deal with issues like this is almost not there, even made worse by what's happening in the US. So I want to see a situation where people are brought together. When I say people, I'm talking about those who really have the tool to deal with this: journalists, civil society, local, groups that really can have impact and effect on this. Because it will shock you to understand that even the Russians pay town criers to spread disinformation. Like people walk on the streets with microphone, or we just word of mouth and scream, "Hey, there's going to be a bomb tomorrow, and the bomb is coming from the US." Such kinds of things. So they use many approaches that are, so unorthodox. And I strongly believe as an individual that sometimes to get results, you have to use the same kind of unorthodox approaches to, So it's only when we do things like this that we can see results.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip. You mentioned that we are talking too much, but no, I'm just kidding. But so we had only 1 hour and we just hardly started. Yeah, so unfortunately we had our limits. But I think that despite our limited time, I hope that at least the audience and those who are following us online saw the diversity of the issue which we're trying to address. And it starts with the huge geopolitical picture, which is substantially changing. Technology steps in, which has impact on our thinking in a way how we are organizing our daily life, and also consumption of information, which very often is mixed up with disinformation. And we also address the issues which are so relevant for individuals, starting from mothers, families, and children. And we would like definitely to continue more and more, but at least I think that the main message is that actually it's very difficult to find those who love this information. Yeah, it's more about how to bring our knowledge and our experience and our practice, and how to counter disinformation and assist those who probably at the present moment lack this particular information. And we all lack certain information, and therefore we are here to watch documentary and to listen stories which will make our understanding what is happening in Ukraine much diverse, wider, and definitely deeper. So Julia, now floor is yours, and I will invite the audience to thank panelists for their fantastic knowledge, expertise, which they shared with us. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julia Kabitsyna-Cabiere. I'm a producer of the documentary that you're about to see. And on behalf of the whole filming crew, I would like to thank Mission of Latvia, Poland, and Estonia for helping organize this event. Thank you to our incredible speakers and our moderator, and to all of you for coming today and participating in this event. The film that you're about to see is a documentary with interviews of 5 men and women that spent a considerable time living in occupied zones, occupied by Russia in Ukraine. And they tell of their daily lives, of their experiences, of what are they going through on a daily basis. This is not a propaganda. This is just true stories of people that did manage to escape the horror that they lived in and right now are in Europe. What we want to bring to the world with this documentary is the truth and to open eyes of the Western society, because as a citizen of Latvia, we are so well aware of what Russian occupation brings. When Russian occupation comes, there is no more life left. They take your language, they take your history, they take your country, they take your independence completely. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, we all know it so well. The rest of the world doesn't know it. And with this documentary, we want to bring the truth of what might happen to all of us if we don't take the threat of Russia seriously. The film was made in cooperation with the Museum of Occupation of Latvia in the former KGB building, that was used as prison to kill political prisoners at the time of Russian occupation. Currently, it's a museum. And I do hope that with events like this, with documentaries like this, it will remain a museum, because there is a real threat of Russian expansion and this museum turning back into prison. So it's not an easy film to watch. And thank you once again, all of you, for coming here. One more thing I would like to add personally is that all of our participants in this film speaking Russian language. They all come from occupied zones on the eastern Ukraine. And I just want to specify this because there was never any prosecution of Russian language in Ukraine. People were allowed to speak whatever they want to speak. And this is one of the facts that counter Russian propaganda that says that Russian speakers were prosecuted. Those people were allowed to speak whatever they want to speak. So thank you very much, and let's watch. To say something. Thank you very much for those who stayed. And I also want to address a little thing. I've noticed the problem with subtitles. There were some mistakes. Somehow it's not the latest version. So I thank you very much for sitting through this and watching it with us.
Thank you, Julia, for showing this documentary. And today, during the discussion, we expressed already a lot of opinions, and I'm not going to repeat. But we from academia very much think in theoretical framework. We consider that theories could bring answers to numerous questions. However, theories are definitely helping us to understand a lot of things, what is happening in this very complicated geopolitical world. But without stories, without storytelling, unfortunately, theory is dead. So therefore, if we want to find solutions, how to assist Ukraine in the best possible ways, we need such stories, Julia, as you told us. And another point which I wanted to mention, I definitely agree with those who say that it's incorrect to use this word that we are tired from war. We are not tired. We are sitting in a warm audience and we are debating. So therefore, so it's even much more responsibility on our shoulders, those who are thinking, who are helping to continue this work in debating and bringing ideas. And those ideas, in the end, will help politicians to make decisions which will serve the common good, peace, and also prosperity in the end to Ukraine. So thank you very much for staying, and thank you very much for participating. And again, I thank 3 embassies. I thank also our panelists, and most of all, of course, Julia, for bringing us here. So thank you. Thank you.